Welcome to part 3 of the rise of political parties. Now we're going to take a quick look at Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton. Now, when we look at Hamilton and Jefferson from a political standpoint, we do have a tendency to engage in what's known as anachronistic thinking, right? Anachronistic thinking is the process where we try and project our values of today into the past where they don't really fit and they probably don't belong. For example, we have a tendency to refer to Hamilton as very conservative and Jefferson as very liberal. But when we really take a look at the definition of those words and try and apply it to these men, it doesn't really work. Alexander Hamilton is going to be a forward thinker. He's going to invent an entire banking system for the nation. That's hardly a conservative thing to do. And liberal Thomas Jefferson is engaged in one of the oldest institutions in existence, slavery. Again, not very liberal. Another term that often gets thrown about is aristocratic and democratic. Alexander Hamilton's very aristocratic. Well, not when you consider the fact that he was born a bastard child in the Bahamas. I mean, in this case, we're really just associating aristocracy to the fact that he was from living in New York City. And democratic, Thomas Jefferson. Well, when we take a look at the democratic Thomas Jefferson, I certainly don't think that applies to his slaves, don't you? And when we get down to it, George Washington selected these men not because necessarily their beliefs, but because he believed that they were capable, competent, and they maintained sectional balance. When he was appointed as the leader of the Continental Army, John Adams had suggested him because the fighting was happening in the North, and he wanted a respected man from the South in order to create sectional cohesion across the now nation, right? Don't think that lesson wasn't lost on George Washington. He's trying to do the same thing. Alexander Hamilton is former aide-de-camp from New York, right? Thomas Jefferson is one of his colleagues from Virginia, right? He's still trying to maintain that sectional balance. So when we take a look at this, we see that none of this stuff really fits. Alexander Hamilton loved Britain, but he didn't love Britain because he was being aristocratic. He loved Britain because it fit his economic model. He has to try, as Secretary of the Treasury, to create a system in which the economy of the United States now can work. In order to do that, you have to have the most powerful trade partners as possible, especially when you consider his model did rely heavily on tariffs and trade taxes, right? Some say he was anti-Republican. That's absolutely not true. Matter of fact, he was very Republican. He felt, matter of fact, that property requirements for voting was ridiculous. Remember, he lives in New York City. Not all successful people living in New York City necessarily own land, right? Meanwhile, Jefferson loves France. Is it because he's being democratic and, because we have eventually the French Revolution and all that? No, again, this doesn't work. Jefferson liked France over Britain even when it was still under King Louis XVI, right? It had nothing to do with the French Revolution and everything to do that it was not Britain. He was anti-federalist. That's why he was more inclined towards the French. And the French, this was not lost on them either, right? They referred to Jefferson that their friendship with Jefferson was a friendship of convenience. And both these men were Republicans, deeply Republican. They believed in representative government, and they both believed in liberty. Now, where the difference comes is maybe how they would define it. An important note about both of these men as well is that they were both not in favor of democracy. They both did not believe in the concept of mob rule, that democracy should be open to everyone, right? Now, who it should be open to, there was some disagreements on, but pretty much all these founding fathers didn't. Remember, we talked about this tyranny from below. They didn't want mob rule. In the Federalist Papers, Federalist Paper number 10, James Madison wrote that it may be conducted that pure democracy, by which I mean society consisting of a small number of citizens who assemble and administer the government in person, can admit no cure to the mischiefs of faction, right? So he's voicing his concern about factionalism that mob rule would inspire. Both Hamilton and Jefferson believe in this, right? The difference is that Jefferson believed that only people who were landed should be involved in this new form of republicanism because of the stake in society theory. You own land and therefore you have a stake in society, and therefore you should be allowed to, say, for example, vote. But cautionary tale about this. This doesn't make him more democratic. For example, he would say that, yes, yeoman farmers, in other words, just small country farmers, should be allowed to vote because they have that stake in society, but they, to quote him, should be mindful to vote for their betters, right? He's not suggesting that the yeoman farmer should run for office, and he also points out that they should be voting for the people that the more educated, the aristocratic gentry, if you will, says that they should be voting for. Hamilton, on the other hand, said that society is governed by self-interest. Self-interest rules human nature, right? And so, therefore, he says that people left to their own devices are prone to quarrel and fight. And so there needs to be more structure on how these things are set up. When you ultimately look at these two men, you take a look at Jefferson, what you see is a man that's guided more by idealism, and Hamilton is more pragmatic. He's more guided by realism.